The photograph arrived in silence. No envelope, no return address. Just a faded black and white portrait slipped between the pages of a donated diary at a military archive in Suffolk, England. 8 men stood before a B-17 flying fortress on a misty airfield in the summer of 1943. Their faces were calm, almost too calm, like men who had just walked away from something they weren't supposed to survive. But it wasn't their expressions that stopped me cold. It was the shadow behind them. The bomber in the background was barely visible, half dissolved in fog, as if the photograph itself couldn't decide whether the plane had ever really been there. And then there was the man on the far left. Crew jacket unbuttoned, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the frame. He looked like he was already gone. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in hurried pencil, were 5 words. Only one brings them home. No date, no signature, no explanation. I've spent years collecting lost portraits from World War II. Images abandoned in attics, tucked into Bibles, forgotten in the margins of history. But this one felt different. This one whispered. It wasn't a record of triumph. It was a confession. The men in the photo weren't celebrating. They were waiting. At first glance, it seemed like a standard crew portrait. Proud airmen posing before a mission, capturing a moment of brotherhood before climbing into a steel coffin with wings. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it became. The co-pilot held a folded letter in his hand, thumb pressed hard against the paper as if trying to keep something from escaping. The navigator's gaze was distant, hollow, and the man in the back, the one who should have been standing with the others, stood apart like he knew something they didn't. The archive director, a woman named Eleanor with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many stories end badly, handed me a magnifying glass without a word. She'd learned long ago that some photographs demand closer inspection. I leaned in. The details sharpened. The co-pilot's letter, creased, worn at the edges, had a corner sticking out just enough to reveal a single word in delicate handwriting. Promise. That's when I noticed the second anomaly. The pilot, standing center frame with his hand resting on the shoulder of the bombardier, wore no wedding ring, but there was a pale band of skin on his 4th finger, a ghost of metal recently removed. The bombardier beside him had his jaw set tight, teeth clenched behind a forced smile. And the tail gunner, barely visible in the back row, had his arms wrapped around himself, not in cold, but in something closer to grief. This wasn't a photograph of men who had just survived. This was a photograph of men who had just lost. I began my search that same night. The diary it came from belonged to a woman named Margaret Hale, a Red Cross volunteer stationed near an airbase in East Anglia. Her entries were sparse, careful, written in the clipped tone of someone who had learned not to hope too much. Most were mundane. Supply deliveries, coffee rations, lists of names she'd heard wouldn't be coming back. But one line, dated July 12, 1943, stood out like a wound that never closed. They came back. All of them. God forgive me. I didn't think they would. The photograph had been taken the day after a bombing run over Bremen, a mission that, according to official records, had been a success. The crew had returned intact. The fortress had landed safely. 0 casualties. Nothing in the logbooks suggested anything unusual. The mission was filed away as routine, another tick mark in the endless ledger of war. But Margaret's words told a different story, and so did the photograph. I traced the tail number of the B-17 visible in the background, a blurred but readable 227 stamped on the vertical stabilizer. It belonged to a bomber nicknamed the Shepherd, part of the 381st Bombardment Group. The name was painted just below the cockpit window in faded white letters, barely legible in the fog. And according to every military document I could find, that plane never flew again after July 1943. It was scrapped 2 weeks later. No mechanical failure listed, no combat damage recorded, no explanation given. Just gone. Erased. I reached out to a historian at the National Archives who specialized in bomber command records. He was skeptical at first. Scrapped planes were common, he said, especially after heavy missions. Metal fatigue, structural damage, bad luck. But when I sent him the photograph, he went quiet. 3 days later, he called me back. "There's something you need to see," he said. He'd found the crew manifest. 8 names. Pilot, Captain Thomas Garrett. Co-pilot, Lieutenant James Ashford. Navigator, Lieutenant David Brennan. Bombardier, Sergeant Michael Delaney. Radio operator, Sergeant Peter Whitfield. Engineer, Sergeant Raymond Keller. Waist gunner, Sergeant Charles Bennett. Tail gunner, Sergeant William Cross. All 8 men survived the Bremen mission. All 8 men were photographed the next day, but only 7 of them flew again. The 8th, Lieutenant James Ashford, the co-pilot holding the letter, was grounded 3 days later. Medical discharge. No combat injuries. No listed cause. Just a single notation in his file. Unfit for further service. He never spoke about what happened over Bremen. Not to military investigators, not to his family, not to anyone. And 6 months later, he disappeared. I sat in the dim light of my study. The photograph spread before me like a map to a country that no longer existed. The faces stared back, young, exhausted, bound together by something stronger and more terrible than survival. 8 men who came home. 7 who kept flying. 1 who couldn't. Margaret Hale had written one more entry, weeks after the photograph was taken. It was brief, almost careless, as if she were trying to convince herself it didn't matter. Lieutenant Ashford left today. Didn't say goodbye, didn't say anything. Just gone like smoke. I needed to know who they were. I needed to know what happened in the sky over Bremen. And most of all, I needed to know which one of them made it back, and why the others, in some unspeakable way, never really did. There are moments when a photograph stops being a record and becomes a confession. I sat in Eleanor's archive office for 6 hours straight, the magnifying glass becoming an extension of my hand, my eyes tracing every shadow, every fold of fabric, every microscopic gesture frozen in that summer of 1943. The photograph was deteriorating. I could see it now, the way time had begun to devour the emulsion from the edges inward. But before it disappeared entirely, it was trying to tell me something. Eleanor brought me coffee without asking, placed it quietly beside me, and left. She understood. People who work with history learn that sometimes you have to sit with ghosts until they speak. The first detail I'd noticed was the letter in James Ashford's hand. But now, under magnification, I could see something more. The letter wasn't sealed. It was folded once, twice, 3 times, creased so many times that the paper looked like it had been read and reread until it was nearly transparent. And there, in the corner, visible only because the light caught it at precisely the right angle, was a woman's name, written in fountain pen. Eleanor. Not Margaret. Eleanor. My hands trembled as I photographed that detail with my digital camera. Eleanor. The same name as the archivist who had handed me the magnifying glass. I looked up. She was pretending to file documents, but her shoulders were rigid, her movements too careful. She knew. She had known all along. But there was more. The photograph itself contained layers of deception. The crew stood in a precise military formation. Officers in front, enlisted men behind, except for one man. The bombardier, Michael Delaney, was positioned slightly forward of where protocol demanded, his body angled toward Captain Garrett in a way that suggested something beyond military hierarchy. Their hands were almost touching. Almost. And Delaney's eyes, when I examined them closely, held a tenderness that couldn't be explained by brotherhood alone. This was 1943. This was wartime England. This was the kind of truth that could destroy men. I expanded my search, digging deeper into Margaret Hale's diary. The entries became less sparse as the summer progressed. July 15th. The shepherd's crew came to the canteen. Ashford wasn't with them, said he was ill. Nobody believed it. July 22nd. Saw Ashford walking alone near the airfield fence at dusk. He didn't see me. He looked like a man carrying something he couldn't put down. August 3. Heard they're shipping Ashford out. Medical discharge. Nobody knows why. Everyone's pretending not to know why. But then, Buried in the margins of an entry from August 10th, Margaret had written something in such small script that it was almost invisible. James told me, "In the chapel," he said, "some loves don't survive the war, Margaret. Some don't survive the truth." Then he left. He said he was going home to Ireland, to his mother's farm, to die quietly. I looked again at the photograph, at James Ashford's face, at the way his body was positioned, not with the others but separate, as if he'd already begun the process of disappearing. His eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at someone just beyond the frame, someone to the left. I enhanced the image digitally, zoomed into the background, and there, barely visible, almost a ghost in the fog, was another figure. A woman, holding a camera. The photographer. The witness. My phone rang. Eleanor's voice was quiet, measured, but underneath was something fracturing. "You found it, didn't you? The woman in the photograph." "Who was she?" I asked. "My grandmother," Eleanor said. "Her name was Alice. She was a war photographer attached to the 381st Bombardment Group. She documented everything. Missions, crews, moments. She had the kind of eye that saw what people were trying to hide." "And the letter?" "Eleanor, written in the corner." There was a long silence. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice had changed. Older, carrying the weight of 70 years of family silence. "That was my grandmother's name, Alice Eleanor Whitmore. But everyone called her Eleanor. She and James Ashford were in love, in a time when that love couldn't exist, in a war where it would have destroyed him. So they kept it hidden, until the mission over Bremen. I waited. The archive seemed to hold its breath. James was the co-pilot," Eleanor continued. "But on that mission, something happened. Nobody ever said what. The official reports say nothing went wrong. The bomb load was delivered. The fighters were evaded. They came home. But James came home broken. Not physically, spiritually. My grandmother photographed him the next day because Captain Garrett ordered a crew portrait. Routine, morale. But Eleanor, my grandmother, she knew. She could see it in his face. He'd made a choice in the sky over Bremen. A choice that had killed something in him." "What choice?" I asked. "I don't know," Eleanor whispered. "My grandmother never wrote it down. She destroyed most of her photographs from that period, destroyed them by hand, burned them. This is the only one that survived. She hid it in that diary, and the diary was hidden in a box in her attic for 50 years. It wasn't until after she died that my mother found it." I looked at the photograph again, at James Ashford's hollow eyes, at the woman barely visible in the background, holding a camera, documenting the moment when her lover became a ghost. "He left England 3 weeks later," Eleanor said. "Went back to Ireland. My grandmother tried to follow him, but he wouldn't see her. He wrote her one letter. Just one. She kept it her whole life. It's in the archive now, sealed. I was told never to open it. But you should." "Why?" I asked. "Because," Eleanor said, "some photographs are meant to be solved, and some letters are meant to be read." She placed an envelope on my desk. 70 years old. Sealed. Written in a soldier's careful hand. "To Eleanor, if you ever need to know." Inside was the answer to everything, and it would change the way I understood the photograph forever. The letter was sealed with wax, a formality from another era, and I almost couldn't bring myself to break it. Eleanor watched from across the room, her hands folded on the desk, her face a mask of composure that had taken a lifetime to perfect. She had guarded this secret for decades, not out of shame but out of respect for two people whose love had been both their salvation and their destruction. Now, at 73 years old, she was finally allowing someone else to hold the weight of it. The archive fell into that particular silence that only occurs when history is about to reveal itself. I carefully peeled back the wax. The envelope contained a single page, written in neat military script. The date was August 15th, 1943. The handwriting was steady, but underneath that control was the tremor of a man holding himself together with nothing but willpower and shame. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I've failed you in the way I've failed everyone who counted on me. I'm writing this because I need someone to know. Because a secret this heavy will kill me faster than any German fighter ever could. And because you deserve the truth, even if the truth destroys what we had. I read aloud, my voice barely steady. Eleanor closed her eyes. Over Bremen, the letter continued, everything changed. We were at bombing altitude, flak bursting around us like angry stars. Captain Garrett was calling out targets. Michael, our bombardier, was locked onto the industrial sector. 3 minutes to payload release. That's when I saw it. I paused. Eleanor's hands tightened on the desk. A school, the letter said. It was marked on no map. No intelligence report mentioned it. It was just there, in the industrial district, surrounded by residential blocks. I could see children in the courtyard. Eleanor, I could see their faces. Tiny, clear in the morning light. And I knew with absolute certainty, that if Michael released the payload on schedule, those bombs would fall directly on that school. The archive seemed to stop breathing. I had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice. Tell Captain Garrett. He would never disobey orders. He couldn't. The mission parameters were clear. The target was the manufacturing plant, and everything around it was considered acceptable collateral. But I was co-pilot. I had authority to request a deviation. So I did. I told Garrett the instruments were reading anomalies. I told him we needed to shift position, adjust our approach. I lied, Eleanor. I lied to my captain, my crew, my country. Eleanor opened her eyes. Tears were streaming down her face silently without sound, as if her body had learned long ago that grief should be witnessed without announcement. Garrett trusted me, the letter said. He adjusted our course. Michael had to recalculate the drop. We released our payload 40 seconds later than planned, shifted 200 meters south. The industrial plant was devastated. The targets were destroyed. The mission was successful. I looked up from the page. Eleanor was staring at the wall, at nothing, at everything. But here's what I did, the letter continued. By shifting our position, I sent our bomb load toward a residential block, toward families who had nothing to do with the war machine, toward homes, not factories. The intelligence reports later said approximately 230 people died in that area. Children, mostly. Because I chose their lives over other children's lives. Because I played God in the sky above Bremen, and decided that my certainty about one school was worth more than obedience, more than duty, more than the lives of people I would never meet. Eleanor made a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a word, just the noise of a heart breaking on a 70-year delay. I kept silent for 3 days, the letter said. Then Michael found me. He'd seen my face when I made the call. He knew something was wrong. We went to the chapel at the airfield, and I told him everything. Michael is braver than I am, Eleanor. He immediately said we should report it. We should tell command. We should face the consequences. But I was a coward. I couldn't face what I'd done. I couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd murdered children trying to save children. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. So I did what cowards do. The letter continued. I went to the base doctor and told him I was unstable, that I was hearing voices, that I was having violent thoughts, that I wasn't fit to fly. I gave him permission to ground me. I gave up my uniform, my rank, my brotherhood with the crew. I ran. I ran home to Ireland, to my mother's farm, to a place where I thought I could hide from what I'd become. But you can't hide from this, Eleanor. The school was rebuilt. The families were buried. And I've spent every day since trying to decide if I was brave or if I was a murderer wearing a different name. I stopped reading. The page continued, but Eleanor had begun to speak. He came home, she said quietly. Years later, after the war. My grandmother wrote about it in letters she never sent. He'd aged 20 years. He was sick, some kind of wasting sickness, the doctor said. But she knew it was guilt. It was the knowledge of what he'd done, what he hadn't done, what he'd never be able to undo. They met once in Dublin, at a cafe near the river. He told her he loved her. He told her he was sorry. And then he asked her to forget him, to live a life he couldn't live, to be happy in a way that was no longer possible for him. Did she? I asked. She tried, Eleanor said. She married a photographer after the war. A good man. She had children. She lived a full life. But she never forgot James. She kept that photograph. She kept that letter. She kept the knowledge that the man she loved had made an impossible choice in the sky, and that choice had haunted him until the day he died. I looked back at the letter's final lines. Tell Eleanor that I chose her life over mine the moment I heard those children in the courtyard. Every decision after that was just me trying to live with that choice. I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask that she knows. Some loves don't survive war. Some don't survive the weight of what we do in the name of survival. But they matter anyway. They matter because they're real. And I will carry her with me into whatever comes next. Not as happiness, but as proof that I was capable of love, even when I was incapable of living. It was signed simply, James. Eleanor reached across the desk and took the letter from my hands. She held it like it was made of glass, like it might shatter if she breathed too hard on it. Now you understand, she said. The photograph wasn't about triumph. It was a goodbye. Those men were saying goodbye to each other, and James was saying goodbye to a life he could never live. And my grandmother was there, behind the camera, documenting the moment when everything changed. I understood, and I knew that what came next would require me to find the survivors, to piece together what happened after Bremen, to trace the ripples of that one moment in the sky across 70 years of silence. The investigation was only beginning. James Ashford was 24 years old when he first saw Eleanor Whitmore, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life had just ended and begun in the same moment. It was June 1943, at an airfield in Norfolk, England. The war was eating men alive, consuming them in missions over Germany, burning them in fiery arcs across European skies, grinding them down under the weight of orders and duty and the knowledge that most of them wouldn't see another Christmas. James had been flying for 8 months. He'd completed 17 missions. He'd watched 3 crews burn, and he'd learned not to think about anything beyond the next takeoff. But then Eleanor walked through the hangar with her camera, and the world shifted on its axis. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. Her face was too sharp, her eyes too intelligent, her presence too solid and real for the cinema ideal of beauty that the soldiers clung to. She moved like someone who had work to do, and no patience for distraction. She wore military-issue coveralls, her dark hair tied back severely, and she carried her camera like it was a weapon. When she looked through the lens, the world disappeared for her. Everything else ceased to matter. James watched her photograph the crew of the Shepherd during a routine equipment check. She moved around them with precision, adjusting angles, waiting for light, capturing something in their faces that they didn't know they were showing. When she turned the camera on him, James felt exposed. Not physically, but spiritually, as if she could see through the carefully constructed facade he'd built to survive war. "Don't move," she said. "Most men try too hard when the camera's on them. You just have to be still, be real. Let me see who you are." He stood absolutely motionless while she photographed him from 3 angles. When she lowered the camera, she smiled. Just barely, but enough to change her entire face. "You'll do," she said. Then she was gone, moving on to the next crew, the next moment, the next piece of evidence that war existed and that someone needed to document it. James couldn't stop thinking about her for 3 days. He found her in the darkroom, a converted storage room where she developed photographs late into the night. The red light gave everything the color of blood. She was bent over a contact sheet, magnifying glass in hand, studying the faces of men who were already dead or would be soon. She didn't look up when he entered. "I know who you are," she said. "Co-pilot on the Shepherd, 24 years old, from County Cork, Catholic, engaged to a girl in Dublin you haven't written to in 6 weeks. How did you—" "I know everyone," she interrupted. "It's my job. I document the 391st. Every pilot, every crew, every loss. I memorize them. Because when they don't come back, someone needs to remember they existed. Someone needs to have their photograph." She looked up at him then, and James saw something in her face that matched something in his own. A recognition that transcended explanation, that operated on a frequency beyond reason or propriety, or the rigid hierarchies of wartime. "I'm Eleanor," she said, "and you shouldn't be in love with me. It will destroy you." "I'm already destroyed," James said. "The war did that. You're just the first beautiful thing I've noticed since it happened." She laughed. A real laugh, surprised and genuine. "You're either the most honest man I've ever met or completely mad." "Probably both," he said. They met in the chapel every evening for 2 weeks. Not touching, never touching. They understood without speaking that even that could be too dangerous. They just sat beside each other in the shadows while the rest of the war continued outside. They talked about everything except what they felt. They talked about her photography, about his family in Ireland, about books they'd read, about music, about the color of light on different kinds of days. They skirted around the central truth, that they were in love with each other in a time and place where that love could only destroy. "After the war," Eleanor said one evening, "if we both make it, if the world doesn't end, maybe then." "I won't make it," James said. He knew it with the certainty that all combat pilots carry, the knowledge that their luck is finite, that each mission is a negotiation with probability, that eventually probability catches up. "Then we make it count now," Eleanor said. "Not by touching, not by doing anything that could be used against either of us. We just exist in proximity. We remember that before the war ends us, we remembered what it felt like to want someone. That has to be enough." It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But they accepted it anyway, because acceptance was the only choice available to people in love during wartime. On July 11, 1943, the night before the Bremen mission, Eleanor broke her own rule. She kissed him in the dark room in the red light that made everything look like the end of the world. It lasted 3 seconds. When she pulled away, she was crying. "Come back," she said. "Come back alive, and we'll find a way. I don't care what it costs. We'll find a way." "I will," he promised. He was lying. They both knew he was lying, but they needed the lie more than they needed the truth. The next morning, he flew toward Bremen, toward the choice that would change everything, toward the moment that would separate him forever from the only person who had ever seen him clearly and loved him anyway. The Shepherd climbed through morning cloud cover at precisely 06:45 hours on July 12, 1943. Captain Thomas Garrett was a veteran of 13 missions, an old man by bomber standards, weathered by flak and fear, and the weight of decisions that meant life or death for 8 other men. He flew with the confidence of someone who had cheated probability so many times that he'd begun to believe he was invisible. Michael Delaney, the bombardier, was praying. He always prayed before bombing runs, not asking for safety, but asking for accuracy, asking that if men had to die, his aim would be true, that he wouldn't miss and rain destruction on civilians instead of military targets. It was the prayer of a Catholic boy from Boston, who understood that war corrupted everything it touched, even prayer. James Ashford sat beside Garrett in the co-pilot seat and tried not to think about Eleanor, tried not to think about the kiss, tried not to think about the impossibility of their situation or the way her tears had felt against his cheek. The radio crackled with coded messages. The engines roared with a sound like continuous thunder. Below, England disappeared, and the channel opened beneath them like a mouth. By the time they reached the German coast, flak was already reaching up, black flowers blooming in the sky, each one a calculation designed to bring them down. The Shepherd twisted and dove, climbed and banked, following the evasive pattern that had kept them alive this long. Around them, other bombers of the 381st held formation, a metal armada moving through fire toward a target that had been assigned by men who would never see the results of their orders. 2 minutes to target, Michael called from the bomb bay. His voice was steady, professional, carrying the weight of precision. Below them, the city of Bremen sprawled, industrial sections marked clearly by smoke and previous bombing, residential blocks tangled between factories and warehouses. The bombardier's view was restricted to what his optical system could perceive. He saw the target, a manufacturing plant producing ball bearings for German aircraft. He began his approach, his hand on the bomb release mechanism, waiting for the precise moment when velocity and altitude and wind speed aligned to ensure the payload would find its mark. That's when James saw it. The school was small, painted white, with a courtyard visible even from bombing altitude. There were children there. A dozen, maybe more, their small figures clear in the morning light. They were on a break, he assumed. A moment of normalcy in a city under siege. The school was positioned exactly 0.3 kilometers south of the manufacturing plant, close enough that the blast radius of a bomb designed to level factories could easily encompass a building designed to house learning. James's hands moved without conscious decision. He reached for the intercom. "Captain, I'm reading instrument anomalies. Port engine compression fluctuating. We need to adjust position. Recommend 200-meter southerly correction." The lie was so smooth it surprised him. In that moment, he understood what it meant to be a coward, not as weakness but as a specific kind of clarity. He could see the school, he could see the children, and he could lie with a voice so steady that Captain Garrett believed him without question. "Roger that," Garrett said. "Adjusting course, bombardier, recalculate for new vector." Michael keyed the intercom. Recalculating 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds lasted an eternity. James stared out at the city below, at the white school, at the children who didn't know that a stranger in the sky was rewriting their fate. The engines hummed. The flak continued to explode around them. And in those 30 seconds, James Ashford made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Ready," Michael said. "Payload release in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, bombs away." The Shepherd lurched upward, suddenly lighter, suddenly free of the weight it had been carrying. Below, the earth erupted. The manufacturing plant disappeared in flame and smoke. But so did the residential block that James had shifted them toward. His lie had saved the school. His lie had doomed the apartment complex where, according to the damage reports filed after the war, 247 people had died. 93 of them were children. The crew flew home in silence. Not the comfortable silence of a job well done, but the silence of men who understood that something fundamental had fractured. Michael called down from the bomb bay, his voice different now, carrying a question he didn't dare ask. "Sir, I got the manufacturing plant, but the secondary explosions suggest our payload affected the residential sector significantly." "Fog," Garrett said. "Visibility issues. Navigation had to adjust. It happens. Target was destroyed, that's what matters." But Michael knew. James could feel it through the intercom. The bombardier had seen the shift in course. He'd recalculated. He'd understood. And he would carry his own version of this guilt for the rest of his life, because he'd released the payload regardless of where it fell. When they landed, the ground crew treated them like heroes. They'd completed another mission. They'd made it back. The plane was already scheduled for another run in 3 days. But as James climbed down from the cockpit, he looked across the airfield and saw Eleanor standing with her camera. Their eyes met for one fraction of a second, and she lowered the camera. She knew. That evening James found Michael in the chapel, kneeling at the altar with his hands pressed together so hard his knuckles were white. James knelt beside him, and Michael began to speak without turning around. "We killed civilians, didn't we?" Michael said. "You shifted our position. I saw the recalculation. You shifted it toward the residential area." "I saved a school," James said. "And you murdered families in an apartment complex," Michael replied. "Don't you see? That's how war works. You can't save one group without condemning another. You can't play God without making the decision to sacrifice. I'm complicit in this. You're complicit in this. And there's no absolution for it because there's no way to undo it." They sat in silence while the chapel grew darker around them. Outside, the war continued. Missions were being planned. Other pilots were praying their own prayers. Other bombardiers were learning to live with what they'd done. James understood then that there was no escape from war except by running away. There was no redemption except by accepting the weight and carrying it forward. and there was no love that could survive knowing what you'd become in the sky. He would be grounded the next day. He would go to Ireland. He would live another 60 years carrying the knowledge of what he'd done. And every single day he would think about Eleanor, about the kiss in the darkroom, about the impossible choice he'd made in the sky. Some loves, he would learn, don't survive the weight of what we do in the name of survival. The letter ended there, but the story didn't. I spent the next 3 months tracing the survivors. Captain Thomas Garrett had lived until 1987, spending his final years in a VA hospital in California, his mind deteriorating gradually until he couldn't remember the war, couldn't remember the faces of his crew, couldn't remember anything at all. Michael Delaney had moved to Massachusetts after the war, become a teacher, married, had 3 children. But according to the interview I conducted with his daughter, he'd never spoken about the Bremen mission. He died in 1982, his health destroyed by what she described as an internal wound that never healed. The other crew members had scattered across America and Europe. Some had lived normal lives. Some hadn't made it past the 1950s. But the ones I found, the ones still alive, carried the same fracture. They remembered something about that mission that didn't add up. They remembered James. They remembered the moment when he'd lied to save a school and doomed an apartment complex. I traveled to Ireland in October, following the trail that James had left behind. His family still owned the farm near Cork. His sister, now 91 years old and sharp as a knife, invited me into a kitchen that smelled like peat smoke and memory. James came home broken, she said without preamble. He never said why. Never spoke about the war except to say he'd done something he couldn't forgive himself for. He lived in the cottage behind the house. You can see it from the back window. He kept it clean, organized, like everything had to be in its place to counterbalance the chaos in his mind. Did he ever talk about Eleanor? I asked. His sister's eyes filled with tears. There was a woman, a photographer. She wrote him letters for years. He never opened most of them, just kept them in a box. When he was dying, cancer wasting him away, I asked him about her. He said, "She was the only good thing that happened during the war, and I couldn't let her waste her life on a man who'd become a murderer." That's how he spoke about himself, as if the choices he'd made had transformed him into something other than human. Did he ever go back? I asked. Did he ever see her again? Once, she said. In 1962. He flew to England, stayed 3 days. He never told me why he went or what happened. But when he came back, something had shifted in him. He was sad, but the anger was gone, like he'd finally been able to put the weight down. He lived another 23 years after that. I made the connection without asking her directly. I flew to Dublin and found Eleanor's descendants. Her grandson, a professor of photography, was still alive. He agreed to meet me in a cafe near the Liffey, and he brought with him a box of letters that his grandmother had kept hidden until her death. They were all addressed to James, all of them unanswered. Letters written across decades tracking Eleanor's life, her marriage to the photographer, the birth of her children, the slow accumulation of a life lived in the shadow of a love that had transformed into something else. Not romance, but something deeper. Recognition. The knowledge that she had once been truly seen by another person, and that person had chosen to protect her from the weight of his own destruction. The final letter was dated 1962, the year James had come to England. It was written on thin paper, in a handwriting that had grown shakier with time. "If you're reading this, James, then you came to see me one last time. I didn't know if you would. I thought you might choose to leave the past buried. But you were always braver than you knew. Braver even in your guilt than most men are in their innocence. I've lived a full life, James. I've had a good husband, beautiful children, the kind of ordinary happiness that people pray for. But I've never forgotten what I saw in your face when you came back from Bremen. I've never forgotten the weight you were carrying. I want you to know that I understand now what you did, why you did it, what it cost you, and I want you to know that I forgive you, not because what happened was forgivable, but because I love you, and love is a choice to forgive what can't be forgiven. I release you from the chapel, James. I release you from the past. Go back to Cork. Go back to your mother's farm. Go back to that quiet cottage and finally learn to be at peace. You've served your sentence. The war is over. You're allowed to live now." The letter was signed in Eleanor's careful hand, the woman behind the camera, the one who saw you, always. James never came back to England. He never married. But according to his sister, he did finally find some kind of peace in those last years. He became known in his village as a quiet man who took long walks in the hills, who helped with the church, who spoke to no one about the war but lived like someone who had finally understood the price of survival and accepted it. Eleanor died in 1989, at 86 years old. She'd spent the last decades of her life writing a series of essays about war photography, the ethics of witnessing, the morality of documentation, the way that choosing what to photograph was also choosing what to condemn to oblivion. She'd never explicitly written about James, but it was clear to anyone reading between the lines that her entire philosophy of photography had been shaped by a man she'd photographed 70 years before. The Shepherd was scrapped in August 1943, exactly as the record stated. But before it was dismantled, Michael Delaney had smuggled out a piece of the fuselage, a section that bore the tail number 227. That metal became a wedding ring, crafted in secret by a jeweler in London who understood what was being asked of him. Michael gave it to James before James left for Ireland. I found that ring in an estate sale in Cork, discovered by chance and purchased for almost nothing by a collector who had no idea what he was holding. It still bore the tail number, etched into the inside of the band. Simple, unadorned. A circle of metal that contained the entire war, the entire love, the entire impossible choice that had been made in the sky above Bremen. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the promises that time refused to keep. I stood in the archive office on a gray November afternoon, exactly as I had 3 months before. But everything had changed. Eleanor the archivist was now Eleanor the keeper of secrets, the steward of stories that had been buried for 70 years. The photograph of the Shepherd's crew, 8 men frozen in summer light, had been cleaned, preserved, archived properly. It would live longer now. It would be seen by people who'd never known the war, who'd never known James Ashford or Eleanor Whitmore or Michael Delaney or any of the others. It would become what all photographs eventually become. Evidence that people existed, that they mattered, that their choices rippled forward through time in ways they could never have anticipated. The documentary I created from this research would premiere next spring. It would be shown to audiences who would watch those 8 men stand before that bomber and see them differently now, not as heroes or soldiers, but as human beings trapped in a system that demanded impossible choices and then demanded that they live with the consequences. The film would include Eleanor's photographs, the letters, the testimony of the surviving crew members. It would tell the story of Bremen, not from the perspective of military history, but from the perspective of conscience. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I traveled back to England and found the location where the school had stood. It had been rebuilt after the war, destroyed again in a different conflict, and ultimately replaced with a small memorial park. I sat on a bench there in the same spot where children had played 70 years before, and I thought about the moral mathematics of war. James Ashford had saved 93 children by condemning others. He'd made a calculation, one group's life against another group's life, and he'd chosen based on what he could see, what he could know, what he could live with. He'd been wrong, of course. In war, there are no right answers, only different kinds of wrong. But he'd tried. With his co-pilot's authority and his lover's desperation, he'd tried to rewrite the equation. The memorial stone didn't mention the bombing. It just said, in simple letters, in memory of those who lived here, in recognition of those who didn't, in hope that future generations will choose differently. I placed a copy of James's letter beneath the stone, sealed in a waterproof case. Not because it would change anything, not because it would bring anyone back, but because witnesses matter, because people should know that someone had tried, had failed, had spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that failure, because Eleanor had seen it, because a photographer in 1943 had documented the moment when a man became both a hero and a murderer, And she had chosen to keep that photograph alive, to let it speak, to let the truth exist. I sent the original photograph to Michael Delaney's grandson, who had become a photographer himself. He photographed the photograph, created an exhibit about his grandfather's war experience, and donated the entire collection to the Smithsonian. The image of the shepherd's crew, 8 men about to be separated forever by choices made in the sky, became part of the permanent record. James Ashford died in 1985, quietly, in the cottage behind his family's farm. Eleanor Whitmore died in 1989, having lived long enough to see the Cold War end, and to know that the generation she'd photographed had survived long enough to see peace, however fragile. Their love had never been consummated. It had never been publicly acknowledged. It had never been anything but a whispered thing that existed in dark rooms and chapels and the careful distance they maintained. But it had been real. It had shaped how they moved through the world, how they understood choice, how they accepted the weight of their own complicity in a war that demanded impossible things. The photograph survives them both. The image of 8 young men, unified by brotherhood but separated by secrets, frozen in the moment before everything changed. If you look closely, truly closely, with a magnifying glass and patience and the willingness to see what's hidden, you can read the truth in their faces. You can see James's hollow eyes. You can see Michael's clenched jaw. You can see the co-pilot of the shepherd who chose conscience over obedience, and who paid for that choice with the rest of his life. Some photographs are just moments, slices of time that mean nothing beyond themselves. But some photographs contain entire lives, entire loves, entire moral universes compressed into a single frame. This was one of those photographs. And Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who stood behind the camera in the fog, understood that the most important thing a witness could do was simply to see, to remember, and to refuse to let the story disappear. The war ended 70 years ago, but the photograph remains. And as long as it exists, James Ashford exists, Eleanor Whitmore exists, Michael Delaney exists, the children in the school exist, the families in the apartment complex exist, the choice exists, the moral mathematics of wartime exists, and the possibility that love might survive alongside guilt, that compassion might coexist with complicity, that a single moment in the sky above a burning city might echo forward through generations as proof that human beings, at their worst and at their best, were still capable of trying. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the promises that time refused to keep.